Start by trying to dispel some kind of possible wrong expectations you might have and dispel some possible misunderstandings that I might give rise to. So, just out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with something that in philosophy in the 70s and in the 80s was known as the linguistic turn? Like, yeah. So, a sound 30% of the room, maybe less. What in philosophy used to be called the linguistic turn, like the thing done by Michael Dummett and Donald Davidson, like kind of the core of their philosophy of language and their philosophy of mind, right? So linguistic turn is nothing about like turn taking in a conversation or nothing of the sort. It's like a philosophical claim that I'll try to explain in a bit. And I guess like most of you are familiar with the work done by Michael Tomasello, right? And some of you might also be very well familiar with the work done by Celia Hayes. Am I right in supposing this? All right, so the plan for today is to present what the linguistic turn is supposed to be, to like draw an inference from the this characterization of the linguistic turn and see that it entails that for a creature that doesn't master anything like a natural language, it is not possible in some sense to have thoughts. And given that there is this implication, I will like contrast the heroes of the linguistic turn with something that has been done in developmental psychology, and in particular by Tomasello, who claims basically, among many other things, that pre-linguistic infants are indeed able to communicate in so many complex ways that they clearly show an ability to think in the relevant sense prior to having developed the most basic linguistic competency. And then finally, I will try to understand whether Celia Hayes' interpretation of implicit mind reading might be like a sensible interpretation also of Tomasello's empirical findings, and then possibly do justice to the intuitions that underlie the linguistic turn, right? It sounds like a mess, it kind of is. Bear with me and help me out, right? So the linguistic turn, like this will be very, very sketchy, because what I'm interested in today is just to have this corollary in place. Okay, so we'll not go into the details, we'll not go into the arguments that were proposed. But interestingly enough, the linguistic turn also was born out of a critique of the code model of language, which many, many people that we just criticize like adhere to. But that's for another occasion. So the idea is that philosophers, God knows why, are kind of interested in giving a philosophical account of what a thought is. So thought is here understood as something that has a representational nature. So representations, at the very least, have correctness conditions. So something is a representation only if it can be, in some sense, correct or incorrect. It can also, I mean, if it can be, at the very least, capable of being a misrepresentation as well. Okay, and that's what, like, intuitively we will understand by thought today. Very, very roughly. So the linguistic turn, well, that was the idea by Dummett and Davidson and others, that, you know, such a philosophical account of thought is only possible through a philosophical account of language, right? So we have to start by inquiring like the nature of meaning and the nature of like language uses, and then proceed on to giving an account of the representational nature of thoughts. Well, just to kind of motivate this idea that might sound like utterly crazy nowadays, especially you know, after this kind of cognitive revolution. one initial motivation is that what it is for a creature to have a thought, well, absent language. Well, you know, how do we determine the content of a thought if the creature just do not master a language? How do we know which concepts, like, the creature actually masters? So how can be, like, the content of a thought determined if the creature cannot possibly manifest an understanding of the concepts that are supposed to be in place where the creature have to have that thought? And that's, I mean, answers to that question and, like, possibly also objection to the very question itself, like, I postpone to another occasion. But the thing is that, especially Michael Dummett, and more controversially Davidson, Michael Dummett is quite committed to the idea that ascribing a thought to a creature that does not master a language is very, very problematic. So pre-linguistic creatures as well as non-linguistic creatures can only have something that he calls, like, proto-thoughts. Because the idea is not to deny that there are cognitive abilities, there are skills, there are kind of all sorts of things in place in something that we can call the mind of a non-linguistic creature. That's not the idea. So there is some cognitive activity that just doesn't have the same nature of a thought, where a thought is understood as having a certain structure and having some concepts as, like, constituent components. So what does this have to do with, like, theories in language acquisition? Okay, just to dispel another possible misunderstanding, I will not be concerned with syntax, nor with Tomasello's account of syntax, nor with his, like, account of language acquisition proper. And I will not be concerned with the evolutionary foundations of his project. So I have no commitments. I have, like, nothing to say today about, you know, the evolutionary side or, like, the concerns about grammar and the acquisition of grammar. So what I'm only concerned with today is his hypothesis, according to which it is kids start to acquire a language precisely because they are already able to communicate with adults in very, very complex and sophisticated ways. And the nature of this pre-linguistic communication is what he calls, following Sperber and Wilson, ostensively inferential. So the relevant form of communication that we're interested in today is the ostensively inferential form. It is basically like a development of some Gricean insights, right? So according to these people, like Tomasello first, the form of communication that gets language acquisition off the ground has to be both overt and inferential. So what is overtness? So, okay, just to be clear, of course, communication in this sense has to be intentional. But intentionality is not enough. Because arguably, like, non-human primates do communicate intentionally, but they do not communicate overtly, and they do not draw the same inferences from others' communicative acts, right? So another way of putting the point is that while humans communicate in a cooperative way, and they have both the skills and motivation to cooperate with each other in certain ways, non-human primates just lack those cooperative attitudes. But they are intentional agents, and they do understand others as intentional agents. They just do that in a sort of like very, very egocentric way. Okay, this is the idea. We're not gonna discuss the distinction, the distinction between, like, non-human primates communication and human communication. But the really crucial point is that communication has to be overt, meaning that the communicator, if she is to communicate in an ostensibly inferential way, makes it mutually manifest that she intends to communicate in the first place, right? So, for instance, I might, while preparing dinner, I might be, like, talking to myself, even out loud, and considering some thoughts, and say, okay, now I have to put the tomatoes into the pasta, and that sort of thing. So if someone is around, can hear me, like, thinking out loud, and might, and then might get information from that, might come to know that I'm preparing a certain kind of pasta and so on and so forth. Well, that communication is not intentionally directed at the person who happens to be, by chance, the recipient. But on top of that, it's not even overt. Is the overtness requirement clear? So I have to make it clear, in the first place, that I am trying to communicate something to you. And if I make this clear, you will try to understand what is it that I'm trying to say and what I mean by what I say, you know, on the basis of a very complex network that of mutual knowledge states that we call common ground. All right? This is like, you know, it's a very rough characterization, but you just let's use it as it is, and then let's try to be more precise later on. So, okay, so Tomasello thinks that this is very young infants, and we're talking about infants between the 9 and 18 months of age, are like very, very proficient Gricean communicators. So they understand that others are trying to communicate something to them, and they infer what that relevant other is trying to communicate on the basis of the common ground that they establish in the course of a joint activity. So let's do some examples. So imagine, like, you know, me and a child are tidying up the toys in a room together, and I just establish eye contact with the child. I point to a toy and try to direct the child's attention to the toy and try to establish actually joint attention with the child on the toy. So the child most likely will just fetch the toy and place it into the basket. Okay? Interestingly enough, if another adult comes into the room without having shared this joint activity with the child and points to the same toy, establishing joint attention with the child to the child will most likely not fetch the toy and place it into the basket, but perhaps just hand the toy to the new adult. So it is this flexibility and this kind of sophisticated understanding of communicative acts that made Tomasello think that the good model to characterize pre-linguistic infants' communicative interactions is the ostensive inferential model. Okay, so what's the problem with this model? Well, the main problem is that it's very, very, very demanding from a cognitive and motivational point of view. Because if this model is to work at all, these pre-linguistic infants have to understand others as intentional agents. So, okay, at the bare minimum, an intentional agent is someone who does something, meaning that it's someone that tries to achieves a certain goal by certain means in light of certain informational states that she has. Okay, so the child must understand that adults have goal states, that they have epistemic states, that they know stuff, or that they believe stuff, or that they perceive stuff, or that they attend to certain situations in the surrounding environment. And they try to achieve their goals in certain ways precisely because they have these epistemic states. On top of this, kids also must be able to do something intentionally together with the adults around them. So they must be able to establish joint attention in a very robust way. They must be able to have joint goals. And ultimately this will lead them to the having of joint intentions, right? And they also must be kind of willing to cooperate with others and like provide others with information they might need. And correlatively, they should be able to understand others as willing to help them and as providing them with information that they need. All of this in light of like a joint activity of something that they're doing together with the relevant adult. Okay, so if we're doing something together and I get your attention by establishing eye contact and I direct your attention to, for instance, with a pointing gesture to a situation that is relevant for what we're doing together, and knowing that we both know that we're helping each other in doing what we're doing, well, you will understand my pointing gesture in light of all this, right? And that what gives you and me like the flexibility that we have in our communicative interactions. Is this like reasonably clear? Which is okay, it's complicated, it's like very, very controversial. And indeed, not everyone accepts this, that kids are able to communicate in such complex ways from the get-go. So in particular, Celia Hayes has recently argued that what we call mind reading, understood as like genuine mind reading, so like the attribution to others and to the self of mental states, is actually not in place before language acquisition has begun in earnest. Because she thinks, well, mind reading proper is something that we teach to children. I mean, we teach actively children how to read minds. And according to Celia Hayes, mental concepts also include attentional states, and they also include intentions, and they also include basically all the socio-cognitive requirements that Tomasello thinks are already in place before language acquisition has begun. Okay, so there seems to be like quite a strong disagreement there. So how should we then describe like pre-linguistic children's communicative interaction if Celia Hayes has a point in saying that mind reading is mostly or totally acquired through teaching and learning, where teaching is done in language, right? That's the important bit. Well, there is something that we call implicit mind reading. So it is something that is not genuine mind reading. Instead, it's a set of domain general cognitive mechanisms that simulate the outcomes of mind reading in a much narrower set of circumstances. So how do these mechanisms work? Well, basically, there is a notion of joint attention such that joint attention is a lean enough thing that could be obtained even only on the basis of some inborn attentional bias toward the face of others and then toward the eyes of others and toward the orientation of others' bodies. So orientation of the bodies, all right, or of the face or of the eyes, not just sensitivity to attentional states. Okay, so we just try to eliminate like a mentalistic description of what kids are actually doing. And then, well, if I'm a child and if I tend to follow others' gaze and try to make sure that I get that gaze right, and then every time, most often when I do this, I always encounter some interesting object in the surrounding environment, I will be, in some important sense, encouraged to continue doing this, okay? So joint attention will be established in this very lean way only through some kind of mechanism of associative and reinforcement learning, plus some attentional biases, and without having to have necessarily like mental state concepts, okay? So I'm not subscribing to this view, I'm just trying to do justice to it. Okay, and what about intentions? I mean, there's not just joint attention. I mean, we're doing stuff together. That's how we understand what we mean with a pointing gesture, right? Well, Celia Hayes would say something like, even in those cases, we can always kind of describe what's happening in like alternative ways that do not hinge on mental state concepts. Like, for instance, we can, through mechanisms of associative learning, we might happen to detect sequences of action-outcome relationships, right? So we know just what certain actions in certain contexts done in a certain way will typically lead to. And this can be done, well, without having like concepts of intentions and not even concepts of goal states to begin with. Okay, does this make sense? possibly. I don't know. I'm still like very, very much conflicted about this. But I think there are kind of very, very, obstacles that are hard to overcome. So, the basic opposition that I tried to flesh out today was between like the submentalizing interpretation, that is the interpretation of implicit mind reading given by Celia Hayes, and the ostensive inferential model of prolinguistic communication that is proposed by and defended by Michael Tomasello. So the basic opposition is that on the one hand, Celia Hayes holds that genuine mind reading is only in place in an interesting sense when some robust linguistic competency is in place as well. While Tomasello says, there's no way you can get like language acquisition off the ground without already having some robust mind reading abilities. Not all of them. So Tomasello doesn't think that children as young as 1 year of age do understand that others have false beliefs, okay? But he does think that children as young as 1 year of age understand others as having, for instance, knowledge states or perceptual states, or at least attentional states. And according to him, there is no way to get around this. But why? Well, because of what I said before, because of the flexibility of like infants' understanding and production of pointing gestures before before language acquisition has begun in earnest. So, for instance, a couple of interesting experiments saw infants attempting to repair messages even when the infants themselves got what they wanted, right? So imagine I'm an adult playing with a kid, and we need an object, let's say a ball, and there's a ball just right behind me, and there's another object, let's say something completely irrelevant like a piece of paper just between me and the infant, and the infant let's assume she understood the nature of the game, because that's often the case. And the infant points the ball for me to retrieve the ball and place it on the table between the two of us so we can play with the ball. So the infant does point to the ball. And given this is an experiment, I will for this experimental condition, I will pretend that I got the pointing finger wrong. And I will not hand her the ball, I will just hand her the piece of paper. Okay, this is the control condition. So in that case, infants do attempt to repair the message. But interestingly enough, if I do this, so I pretend to misunderstand the infant's communicative gesture, but by chance, I also hand the ball to the infant will still be puzzled and still attempt to repair the message, even if the infant herself got what she wanted, right? So, according to Tomasello, this is kind of evidence that communication, even at a pre-linguistic level, happens at a mental level. It's not something low level. It's something that requires some mental state concepts and some kind of very robust inferential abilities. But so no experiments in psychology is beyond controversy, right? Even more importantly, the thing that really shows that the complexity of the ostensive inferential model and something that gives us some ground to believe that model actually describes some kind of the reality of infancy, is that infant, as I said in the first example, just understand communicative acts very, very flexibly according to what is it that they're doing with others. So according to the common ground that they build with others in the context of joint activities. And honestly, I think those experiments based on are meant to show that this common ground is in place and that kids are attuned to the common ground are possibly the hardest to explain without assuming that kids have even the leanest mental state concepts available to them. And well, that's it. So nothing, I haven't committed to anything. It was very exploratory. I know it's a mess. There's a lot of Pandora's box in here. I opened just a few of them, and I just wanted to point out that you know, as interesting as Celia Hayes' conception of how do we develop mind reading skills in ontogeny, it could, you know, run into this insurmountable obstacle that is how do we then explain pre-linguistic communicative interactions. All right, thank you all.